Secretariat if you want.
Okay, we'll do that.
Be a real professor.
I don't like that. I have to switch hands. Good morning. I'm Bill, and this is Max, and together we're Dazed and Confused. So, good morning, and welcome to the first round of presentations here at the Central Ohio InfoSec Summit. I didn't think I was going to have such a packed room and some illustrious people here. Josh. So, governance, risk, and compliance is not one of those real sexy things that everybody gets into InfoSec to do. Unfortunately, it's the backbone for everything that we do in building an information security management system. Otherwise, we tend to meander, and we've got really smart people in InfoSec, but being able to really focus our resources and being able to communicate where we are from a status perspective and what do we need to do in order to get the organization better. So we're going to try something a little bit different today. Instead of telling you the typical textbook, hey, what's GRC look like, you know, from the CISM and CISSP, study guides and everything that we tend to do organizationally. And what we're going to do is a little bit more of a case study. So I'm the head of global security at OCLC. So OCLC is a global technology company that supports the library community globally. So 76,000 libraries in 172 countries. And when you think about libraries, you tend to think, okay, public libraries, but it's very different than that. Think governments and national archives. Think special libraries that include military research and development centers, large research and development in pharmaceuticals, in government research, things like the Air Force Research Lab out at Wright-Patt, the Army Research Lab, NASA JPL. So our customers, we're a service organization. So what that brings is a little bit different hat than most of us experience when we're inside an individual organization, in that I have to respond to the security requirements of all the customers. Then some of them are represented here from academic libraries, that we have to be able to answer their questions, especially since some challenges from a vendor perspective. So my first question is, anybody know who Fazio Mechanical Services is? Who said yes? Who is Fazio Mechanical Services? Yep. So they're the HVAC vendor that was connected to Target that was exploited in order to gain access. So we have similar challenges where many of the customers that we have lower their defenses so that they can connect. What does that mean from a GRC perspective? What it means is that we have a very complex environment globally where we have to meet all of the privacy requirements for Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Germany, the EU as a whole, Asia Pacific, as well as the U.S. federal government and the state governments within the United States. So it gives us a unique challenge where we don't have a one-size-fits-all solution. So we also manage a global SaaS cloud, which includes a SaaS, basically an ERP for libraries in 5 data centers globally distributed throughout the various continents. That gives us a lot of challenges in regards to how do we meet the requirements of our customers as well as meet the requirements of our leadership in providing appropriate security and privacy compliance. So I know you'll all say, compliance doesn't equal security. But from a broad perspective, when you're using large frameworks, it doesn't have to, they both have to be integrated, they both have to respond. Those of you who deal with privacy programs, heavy reliance, especially as we start moving into the European world of the general data protection regulation, the GDPR, there's a lot of challenges with how do I ensure that the security controls are in place in order to meet the privacy requirements. And more of that is occurring within the United States. Since 2011, OCLC has been globally certified to ISO 27001. And you'd think, well, that should be good enough. Well, we thought that was good enough. But unfortunately, the changing landscape has really created some challenges for us as well as a lot of you in the room. So how do I meet all of those requirements? We thought originally the executive order for cybersecurity that President Obama signed would have no impact on us. Well, downstream effects. What happened was most of our customers are U.S. federal government, which means that the mandate that went to them was you've got to consume services that meet the Federal Information Security Management Act. So now we're talking about all the global privacy requirements, FISMA compliance, as well as some of our customers, since they're higher eds, have FERPA requirements. Some of the connections that we have to medical libraries include HIPAA requirements. And this gets to be a real challenge for us in being able to meet those requirements, especially since we're a global not-for-profit. So we don't have the deep pockets of a lot of multinational organizations, but we still have all the requirements. I jokingly say that we have all of the challenges of Google because we have an open social stack, multiple Hadoop instances, a global SaaS cloud, 2 petabytes of spinning data, but the budget of a small mom and pop. So, how do we become better at being able to manage this? Add on top of this, the European Court of Justice vacated the agreement between the United States and Europe that we called Safe Harbor, and now putting in place the EU-US Privacy Shield, which is still questionable about whether the EU Court of Justice will actually validate that. That doesn't make any difference to us. We're a not-for-profit, so we don't fall underneath the control of the Federal Trade Commission or any other governmental agency, so we can't even gain protections under the EU-US Privacy Shield. So we actually have to be fully compliant with all of the requirements in each of those countries in the European Union. So that brings about other security challenges, and how do we orchestrate all of this? I already talked about the GDPR. If you do your business in Europe, you better 2018 is, once it's ratified, 2018 will be the implementation date. There are a lot of requirements that are very heavily mandated around security and also around the use of data. So many of the analytic projects that you're doing within your organizations may really need a relook at what is legally sufficient, how do we use that data, how do we communicate with the owners of that data in order to make some real hard decisions. And then we've got some other challenges with specific countries. So there is no United States of Europe. And even in the United States, there is no single information security law or privacy law within the United States. So being able to meet those requirements become increasingly difficult. This should sound familiar to a lot of you that are service-oriented organizations, or even if you do business and have employees who are in foreign countries. So if you've got workers who are in Germany, you probably have a German Works Council. We have a German Works Council. We have a Dutch Works Council. We have other international requirements. Trying to navigate this storm can be a bit of a challenge. So GRC has really taken on a new complexion from the standpoint of how do we meet our privacy requirements, how do we direct the right activities within the organization, because at the end of the day, the only way this is going to add any value is if you know where you are and you know where you need to be. Okay. When I say that, it is, I can talk all day long about, well, I've got patching and I've got these things, but what does that mean from a collective perspective? What does that mean from a risk-based model? The other thing is what frameworks are you using? So if you're using ISO 27001, you're using a risk-based model. If you're using, NIST 853 to meet government requirements, guess what? It's because mommy or daddy said so. Because NIST 853 and FIPS 199 and 200 are prescriptive. So many of the things that you may not think are really important controls, it's just these are the minimum controls based on the classification of the data, and you're going to do all of those, 100 plus controls, and, because mommy and daddy said so. Now, we'll talk about there are some options with how do I have my plan of action and milestones. So the real value out of a GRC program comes from the fact that I understand what I need to do to get better. And what we talk about is, we do our enterprise risk assessments, and we get an idea of what projects need to be done. What about prioritization? What's the value of those activities? How does that fit into what we're doing from a roadmap perspective within the organization? So when I talk about all of these different challenges, I end up with, a couple of things that we had. For those of you who may not know, there's a thing called the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program, FedRAMP. So all cloud providers that provide services to the U.S. government, the government expects that you're going to be able to demonstrate all of your security controls in packages, certification and accreditation packages, which go to a joint accreditation board, the JAB, where they make decisions on whether or not they'll accredit you to do business with the government. Okay. Now, doesn't help us because we also do ISO 27001 because we have a global constituency as well. So navigating and mapping those becomes a bit of a challenge. The other issue is, anybody here work government and do certification accreditation packages? No? One. So being able to speak the language of the government is unique. It's like going to your neighbor who's a lawyer and going, hey, I'm thinking about getting divorced, can you help me? And he goes, I can't help you unless you murder your wife because I'm a criminal attorney. Speak the different language, different expectations. Jared's going, I'm planning this one. Write that one down, right? The ability to speak the language, the ability to create a system security plan is extremely limited within the security workforce unless you've got very specific experience in writing CNA packages for the government. So, to be honest, I'm the only one of my staff who has any experience in the government and doing certification and accreditation packages. All really smart security people, been doing this for years, but don't know how to create a system security plan. Don't know how to create a plan of action and milestones. We use different languages, so I've got to be able to bridge those languages as well. The real problem is mapping. So you're all familiar with the Cloud Control Matrix, Cloud Security Alliance. So the Cloud Security Alliance has, so you should know this when you're acquiring cloud services. So probably many of you in your organizations, your CIOs and your executives are all saying, I want to reduce cost, I want to add value, I don't want to spend money on IT, let's just outsource it and let's go to cloud. So things like Workday and Salesforce.com and ServiceNow, all cloud-based services, you should be looking at that from the standpoint of how am I acquiring services, how do I know that the services I'm acquiring are meeting the security requirements of the organization. So there's a voluntary certification, and it does some mapping, but the mapping is not very robust. The other option is the Unified Compliance Framework, which is very heavy, and it doesn't tell you, it maps all the requirements, but it doesn't really tell you what to do. So that becomes a bit of a challenge. And then when you look at our typical environments, HIPAA high-tech, ISO 27001, NIST 853, FedRAMP, it's an alphabet soup. So how do we reconcile all this to meet efficiently so we can add value and meet management's expectations as well as, not lose our minds? So on top of this, probably if you're a service provider, you've also got to do an SSAE 16 where you've got auditors. We've got that as well. So the issue is that I can't constantly beat up the staff with having different rules based on different systems in different environments. So we came up with a unified control matrix, and that tries to take all of these different requirements. I mean, so if you've ever looked at NIST 853 and you look in the back, they've got Table H and they map ISO 27001 and NIST 853. One of our customers is actually NIST. And I said, what you've done there is you've implied that my ISO 27001 has reciprocity to FSMA. And they said, no, that's not our intent. I'm like, then why did you put it in there? So the answer was just to kind of help you. And I'm like, well, it didn't help me because we were mapping and we were doing that until the government came and said, you can't do that anymore. You've actually got to complete a package and submit it. So it becomes quite an ordeal in trying to take, what we had for the documentation in our control catalog for ISO 27001, which is risk-based, and now map it over to NIST 853 for our U.S. federal government customers in our U.S. data center. It just became an increasingly difficult situation. So we have this combination, this gathering storm, which said, the President of the United States says that all of you as federal government agencies have to acquire from an organization, a cloud provider who meets FedRAMP requirements. Globally, everybody else is telling me I've got to be ISO 27001. I've told you there's incompatibilities between the two, and even though there's a mapping, it's not a very good mapping because it doesn't address the various controls in a level of detail. NIST has deeper explanations. ISO 27002 does not. So many of us think, well, this is great. I'll choose one framework and I'll be able to manage against that framework. Except in reality, customers have different requirements, and you've got to be able to translate and give the customer what they need, and you've got to be able to manage that in some practical way that provides direction for the staff as well as guidance for what we're going to do next. So with our complex customer requirements, being able to map across, what we were doing from a spreadsheet perspective and Salesforce, not Salesforce, SharePoint and ServiceNow and some of the other systems just didn't meet our needs anymore. What I needed was the ability to produce a system security plan quickly. What I found is that I can use NIST 853 and the SSP. From a customer perspective, I can push a system security plan across the table. It answers all of the questions, but it still has meaning when I push the same document across the table from an international perspective. I just have to be careful about the U.S. governmentese, which can get very confusing. Although when you start dealing with the German, the Bundesamt für Sicherheit und Informationstechnik, they're the federal office the Federal Office for Information Security. Those standards are very government-like, but they have full reciprocity for ISO 27001. So what am I trying to really communicate? We have a complex world. We have complex requirements from our customers. We have to be able to manage those internally and translate those into the right controls in order to meet all of the customer requirements. And then we have to have the right set of documentation and the plan for how we're going to execute that. What we lack, though, is we have specific languages, but we have specific language difficulties in translating the requirements from U.S. federal government, international organizations, international privacy requirements, and being able to turn that into a coherent program internally that communicates trust with customers as well as our leadership. So what we ended up doing was looking around for, we needed a non-traditional GRC platform. And I'm not a big fan of GRC platforms per se, but the ability to quickly manage and create the system security plans for our individual services became a real driver for us in how we were able to do that. And we looked around and we only found one product out there that helped us to automated create a system security plan and the plan of action and milestones which would meet all of our requirements and be able to help us to communicate to our staff internally the right activities as well as be able to demonstrate to our customers that we're meeting their requirements. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Max.
How you guys doing? So my name is Max, and I want to kind of step back. I met Bill probably about 2 years ago through a mutual friend, and I never really met him in person. We started kind of talking on LinkedIn, through blogs and online. That's how I kind of got to know Bill. And then my background, I lived in India for about 13 years. I moved here to America. I learned English. Lived in Oklahoma. So if I have a little southern accent, it's because of Oklahoma. 9/11 happened. I started to think about, I had a good mentor. It's like go to the military. So I enlisted. So the next 6 years, 4 years of that, I spent in the Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan, just doing a lot of different things. I joined as a security specialist. And in 2009, I got back, and I'm like, what do I do? And so I started working with a lot of the intelligence agencies as their security officer, chief security officer. And then in 2012, I started my company. We were just, just doing services work. And a lot of the challenges that the organizations today are facing, they've been previously solved by defense in one shape or the other. They may not be implemented correctly, but because defense is a huge, large-scale operation. So if you heard Bill talk about, well, we're in Europe, we're dealing with Canada, we're dealing with global regulations. I'm of the belief that, there's nothing new under the sun. What has been done shall be done again, right? So I'm thinking, this problem that Bill is facing has been solved. How can I solve this problem for Bill, right? So in Department of Defense, you have crazy amounts of regulations that are distributed across different jurisdictions. You have to learn how to operate inside of Europe, Middle East, Asia. Same requirements apply. And it all needs to be fed to a single commander so he can make decisions based on some action insight. And it has to be very manageable. You're not going to send soldiers overseas, right, with like 100 compliance requirements. It ain't never going to happen, right? So when I started to think about these problems, I said, all right, everybody's dealing with massive compliance regulations. NIST 853 is a huge problem. We look at ISO, that keeps updating itself, and that's a huge problem, especially from a mapping standpoint. And when we started working with organizations, everybody that currently has a solution is very unhappy with it, or they work outside of it. How many of you are using spreadsheets today? Right? A lot of you are using spreadsheets, right? And when you're using spreadsheets, you also have, we call them dumb workflows, meaning there's no intelligence built in. There's absolutely no intelligence. You just go from one control to the next, to the next, to the next. And sometimes they repeat themselves, so you find yourself repeating. And there's no intelligence on what artifacts talk to what control, right? And when you look at NIST, there's over like 950 controls. And depending on who you're doing business with, if you're getting any kind of money from the government today, you have to implement NIST to a certain level. Whether they want an official package or not, you have to implement some of the NIST controls, right? So what I started to think about is, how do I educate the executive who doesn't have time? How do I let them know this is a tremendous amount of work and this is not just one guy's job? Because truly, in the government world, there's usually 9 people attached to one package. And most of you today are probably just one person for compliance, or maybe 2. Right? So first I had to think about how do I visually communicate this to an executive in under 5 minutes or less. So I'm going to show you guys that. How many of you guys are familiar with NIST 853? Okay, good. So 853, you have something called families, right? These are all of the families that are inside of that. Inside of each family, you have these things called controls, right? Inside of each control, you have these sub-controls or enhancements. You can treat them just like controls, right? And based on your specification, basically, you're either a moderate, low, or a high. But you can also have these other things called overlays. And essentially what that does is it brings certain controls in scope, and it brings certain controls out of scope. So for a low characterization, these are the controls that are in scope, right? For a high characterization, these are the controls that are in scope. So what I did is when I talked to an executive, I said, hey, look, you're saying I sent you a spreadsheet. You didn't look at it. You're saying that somebody is going to complete all of these things. Just one resource. And then once I actually visualized it and showed it and blew it all up, they're like, wow, this is incredible amounts of work. Right? So that was the first thing that we have to explain to our leadership, that this space is incredibly complex, especially if you're getting money from the government for any kind of research dollars. Or if you're trying to do FedRAMP, which is cloud computing certification, right? So that was the first challenge we're trying to solve, right? Just getting out of spreadsheets and communicating visually to somebody who doesn't live in this world. If you live in this world, you understand it. But majority of the people that you have to get the budgets from, they don't live in this world, right? The second thing is, once you have this inside of a spreadsheet, we normally go to AC1, AC2, or ISO requirement number 1, 2, PCI requirement, so on and so forth. We go in spreadsheets. And I talked about how one control can be related to several controls, or you're answering the same question twice. One policy talks to 10 different controls. These are all inefficiencies built inside of GRC systems today. So what we did, we decided to do what's known as a relationship analysis. So what you see here, outside, each color represents each family. And I'm doing this just with the data set for NIST, so you get the idea. But you can do this with any sort of control set. You can do it with the cloud control matrix, you can do it with ISO, HIPAA, it doesn't matter. So each color represents a different family. Underneath each family are the actual controls. Now I've only put in primary controls. But what this shows is when you're talking about account management, what does that all relate to? How does that impact other controls? That might be managed by other parts of the organization. So today, nobody is doing these kinds of analysis, and it's really impossible to do inside of spreadsheets, right? With this kind of knowledge, you can start to build intelligent workflows. When the analyst is working on AC2, perhaps he should look at all the related controls at the same time, instead of moving on to AC3, right? So these are the things we started working on, and essentially that's what this shows. But another one I want to share with you is this. This is a ridiculous amount of work, right? This has all the 950 controls that are inside of NIST. That's a crazy amount of work. I mean, nobody does this correctly. So you can't even see the actual verbiage that's on there, right? So if I actually zoom in, you'll be able to see all of the controls. But if you're a NIST shop, if you have to comply with government, it gets dictated to you which controls are in scope. But if you're not, and you're looking for something a little bit more prescriptive, because sometimes we as security professionals struggle with interpretation. Well, ISO says this, and I don't really know how to decompose that down. Or, I decompose it down based on my own knowledge because I'm a security professional, but my leadership still doesn't understand because they're reinterpreting it based on, their knowledge, and their knowledge may not be as strong or as sufficient. So this is where NIST comes in handy as a tool to say, all right, the government has already provided mappings. It's not for reciprocity. I wish it was. But it's really for you to decompose and go down a little bit deeper, right? And what you're able to do with this sort of graph, if you're not in this shop, we're able to figure out where that 20% might be. What are the most important controls that are talking about each other, right? So if you want to implement NIST, just partially, maybe 10, 15 controls, which ones those might be, right? We have the SANS, same concept, but this is more through a little bit of a relationship analysis, a little bit of intent analysis, language analysis, right? So that's kind of what this shows. So the other thing I want to share with you, let me go back to my slides. Right. The other thing is, one thing we don't do well, and we do it really well inside of defense or any kind of complex, globally distributed environment, is a concept of inheritance. How many times have you done an assessment for your business unit? You go there, you ask a question like, you run an audit checklist, whatever. The question is, have you done training? And we ask that same question over and over each time we do an audit at a different business unit, right? Or physical security. Do you have, gate guards, locks, and doors, and all these things, right? And the system you're assessing, the scope, is inside of that same data center, inside of that same authority. But you're asking the question over and over. This creates inefficiencies. So what complex environments, distributed environments, especially inside of government, what they do really well is something called inheritance. We do this mentally, but we don't do this through systems. So basic concept is, if you've done training, you send out, let's say usually people send out PowerPoint decks to the entire enterprise, you click through it, you sign it, or you use some sort of software that says you've taken this training, right? Every time that control question comes up, it needs to be relayed down to the next workflow or the next audit. This is called inheritance, where you don't even see it. You're not even asking the question anymore about training because it's automatically done at a central point, right? This is what the government does really well through automation. And we wanted to bring that innovation into a commercial side environment with just as complex requirements, right? So today, if you could go back, I would look at creating a common control catalog. That will allow you to create inheritance. And leverage something like NIST, leverage something like ISO, which maps to NIST. Want to go back on what Bill said, why don't we have reciprocity? Because I actually talked to NIST, and they kind of told me the same thing. Let me see if I can go back to that matrix slide, right? So they told Bill, hey, you can't do reciprocity, which means you get an ISO certification, you can't say it's NIST compliant, right? Because of the fine print. I'll walk over here. Right here. It says, you can't read it, but essentially it says an asterisk indicates that the intent, let me try to read it here. The asterisk indicates that ISO control does not fully satisfy the intent of the NIST control. It's a really fine print, right? So they pointed me back to that, right? But you can still use this mapping to lighten your workload if you're an ISO shop. And then if you need justification on exactly what to do, you can use NIST to present to your leadership to say, this is how it's correctly interpreted, right? And switch between the two, right? So, so that's, that's why I built this, the software. And the other thing is, Bill mentioned about system security plan. Has anybody ever had to do a system security plan, non-DoD? Okay, good. It's usually like 400 pages of documentation. It's ridiculous. And a lot of times you're repeating the same information. And if you have intelligent workflows which move intelligently from one control as it relates to another control, artifacts that automatically gets attached to several controls, that's the only way we're going to solve this problem as GRC professionals. I got 10 minutes, all right? So, so that's what we do. That's how we solve for complexity.
So a couple of things that really should resonate with everybody is, one, how do I gather all of the requirements for the organization? So one of the things, if you've not looked at ISO 27001 2013 that are in there that are absolutely amazing tools that were introduced to help you in order to drive the right behaviors and to gather the right information in the organization, is what's called the interested parties list. So it's a list of all of the interested parties and what are their requirements. And it's a great communication tool, especially at the executive level. In many cases, my HR VP doesn't necessarily, fully understand what it means for HIPAA high tech, being a business associate, from a FCRA FACTA perspective and protecting, the privacy of employees. And the range goes out and out. So that interested parties list is absolutely amazing. If you've not looked at anything, look at that. The other one is another product deliverable for security, and that's called the risk owners list. So who owns the risk? It's funny because there's many cases where it may be intuitively obvious who the risk owner is, but in many large enterprises like ours, the risk owner for 90% of the risks is the CIO. So when I sat down and showed the risk owners list to my CIO, he about had a heart attack. He suspected he had all of those responsibilities, but seeing it in writing, it became real. So nothing exists unless it's written down. I can tell you that for a fact. The other thing is where we fall down from a GRC perspective is I talked about a plan of action and milestones. So what are the gaps? What am I missing? So I have my frameworks. I orchestrate that. What Max showed you that really resonated with me was, okay, how many people here do look at their enterprise and do Pareto analysis? How many people know what Pareto analysis is? Okay, so a number of people, but you may have heard it as the 80-20 rule. So from an error perspective, 80% of your issues are tied back to 20% of the causes. So we look at the security problem in our organizations, and it's easy to become overwhelmed. How do I turn that into something meaningful that I can communicate? Pareto analysis means when we start talking about inheritance and we start talking about pulling that all together, how do we make meaning out of that? Where do I need to direct my resources? Because right now, there's more work than we have people. So what's really important? So think in your mind, what's the difference between the trivial many and the significant few? Okay? That should be the important thing, is your focus should be on the significant few. The next thing is how do I do sensitivity analysis? So you saw some of the concentrations. So how do I know what's working well? Do I have coverage in those particular areas? I'm not going, repeat after me, I'm not going to fix it all tomorrow. The one thing that I find that security people suffer from is what I call the raccoon effect. Shiny object. Let's go play with it. Next shiny object. We've got to focus on a few things. Okay? Focus on few important things, get those done. When you start having success, it'll start driving the rest of the success within the organization. It'll drive credibility within the organization. The final thing I'll mention is this idea of a control catalog. So I'll bet almost everybody in this room will say, yeah, we have controls in place, but then, IT operations changes things, and we didn't know that they changed it. Well, if we communicate that control catalog and what the controls are for our enterprise architecture teams, for our operations team, if they can see and touch the control catalog, this is not a secret, okay? It has to be transparent. It has to be communicated. If they can see it, they know every time I touch a control, I have to go back to security, if I'm going to modify or remove a control because I need to be able to deal with this within the enterprise. That's the practical aspects of this. So you should walk away with, I can still take a tremendous amount of complexity, my PCI DSS compliance, my HIPAA high-tech compliance, my Sarbanes-Oxley, section 404, my FedRAMP, all of this. It doesn't matter. I can condense that down as my requirements into my control catalog, and that becomes how I communicate within the organization, and that's how I drive the right conversations about managing controls as well as my efforts in the right area.
I think we're done. Want to leave some time for questions? Yes, sir.
After my
So there's a couple of things there. What we've done within our organization, and this is, and even we both consume and deliver cloud services. So we'll get the SSAE 16, SOC 1, SOC 2, or SOC 3, depending upon what they have available. Since we've got a lot of overseas requirements. Most of the cloud service providers you will see have ISO 27001. Don't just ask them for the certificate. Get the statement of applicability, because the statement of applicability is the only thing that really has value for you, because it'll describe all of their controls. So what we did was we've got a basic set of documentation which we provide to all of the pre-sales engagements. And what that does is usually take care of 90% of the issues. The other thing is create a frequently asked questions, so that you start capturing that as part of the pre-sales, and you can create that, and you can put that behind a password-protected site that allows the salespeople to then expose that information to customers. I can tell you that Roland Clouthier at ADP uses that model. They use Archer and have their Archer instance exposed outside, and then give access to a portion of that where customers can review policies and some of the other issues. The one thing that I'll tell you that I run into from a service provider perspective is everybody sends and says, well, you have to comply with my security policies. Do you honestly think I can comply with 300 different organizations' security policies? How many of you want to invite me to be on your board to review those security policies? Because guess what? You change those and you get in a requirement, you created a constructive contract which now I can charge your company for. Okay? We got to be smarter. How do we get that information? So we have created a range of deliverables that we can give as part of pre-sales engagements, including a white paper that answers probably 90% of the questions for customers. It's a combination of a SOC 1 and our ISO 27001 statement of applicability. It probably answers the vast majority of questions. We still get questionnaires to complete. Some of them are very intense. But I've worked in a number of different industry spaces where obviously vendor information security has become very important. And so everybody's afraid. Remember Fazio Mechanical Services? Now everybody's scared of every vendor they connect to. So we get questionnaires that are just absolutely incredible. But what we found is we give them a white paper that describes all of our controls. We have our SSAE 16, SOC 1, and we have our ISO 27001 statement of applicability. Once we have an SSP, we'll have that as well. I mean, to be honest, when I push those across the table, there's very few questions that are left because we're transparent with our customers. So you got to think about it. I work very diligently with our sales and marketing people about what are the typical questions we get, how do we do this. There are some high-level system, some security engineering where both the CIO and I had to participate in a sales call for a state, the entire state. So it was an acquisition for that. So think about what your customers need. Try to provide that. That's an issue of product security. That's another topic that many security people are not very familiar with is how do I manage the difference between my enterprise security hat and if the organization sells products and services, how do I do product security? How do I help the organization sell product? Then you're really starting to add value. So that needs to be integrated into your whole GRC process where you're finding out who my interested parties are, what's important to them, how do I help them to be successful. So I'll finish with a Zig Ziglar paraphrased quote. It's all about getting what you want by helping others to get what they want. And security has got to stop being the self-licking ice cream cone that goes, oh my God, we've got to do all of these things. No, let's focus on what's important. Let's devote our resources. Everybody's behind the power curve. So let's really think about how do we rally our resources to do the right things? Any other questions?
You know, this guy.
Mr. Thomas.
This one may be direct. So the world I live in right now, usually, since I deal with risk-based controls a lot, there's subjective, and for better or worse, I'm kind of evaluated on the quality of a management response I can give, or description of compensating control. When I see the relationship wheel there, the first thing that pops into my mind is, if I'm being questioned about such and such control, maybe I have documentation on the rest of the related controls that I can put together, a high-quality management response to say, no, I don't have a funding. You guys find that you use the same tools for kind of reacting to things along the lines that you use for proactive components?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both, right? It just depends on when that happens. So if you're trying to implement, you can use the same software to say, okay, here's one control and it speaks to several other controls. So one artifact, I can relate it to several. But sometimes you can do a gap analysis to figure out where are we leaking, where there might be a potential. I thought I knew what this control was talking about. When I look at the relationships and the supplemental guidance and all the things, the overlays, I don't have a comprehensive understanding of it. So we've seen it both ways, where an organization thought they were actually speaking to a control in its complete level, but then they found out they're not. So absolutely. It can be used for many different things. We like to use it to build intelligent workflows, but you can do all sorts of analysis once you have the data.
Yeah, what you're really talking about is how do I concentrate the right places? So centers of gravity and nodal analysis. So where am I doing well? Where am I not? My CIO, my leadership really likes seeing what the status is. So we end up creating a radar chart based on capability maturity, our current state, future state. This really plays into that in the ability to see specific control groups, as well as, where are my centers of gravity? Where do I have the biggest issues that need to be addressed? Other than everybody knows, identity and access management's the new perimeter. So we're all focused there, as we pull back the onion skin, we find out we're really so bad off there that it's just a mess. And I don't know an organization where it's not.
Questions, right? Time's up. My contact information's up there. You can ask Bill if you can contact him, but you can contact me at any time. Thank you.